What if the greatest destruction of knowledge in history never happened the way we were told? For centuries, we've heard the exact same story. The Library of Alexandria burned. And with it, some of humanity's greatest knowledge disappeared forever. But there is a problem with that story. History tells us something far more complicated. This is Decode Station. Section 1. The Dream of Human Knowledge. Building the ultimate intellectual institution. To really understand how this legendary place ended, we first have to understand how it began. Let's travel back together to ancient Alexandria in Egypt, right around the early 3rd century BCE. The Ptolemaic dynasty had this absolutely extraordinary ambition. You see, the goal wasn't just to build a nice room for reading. Their ambition was to collect, organize, study, and preserve literally as much of the world's written knowledge as humanly possible. The Library of Alexandria was actually just one part of a much larger research institution known as the Mausoleum. Think of it less like a modern public library and more like a massive, bustling ancient university campus. When ships arrived in Alexandria's harbor, any books on board were reportedly confiscated, meticulously copied by scribes, and then added to the collection. Now, the exact number of scrolls they amassed remains a mystery, but the sheer volume of gathered human thought in one place was simply staggering. Because you have to remember, this was a place for brilliant minds to debate, to translate, and to conduct groundbreaking research. It was right here that Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth with just breathtaking accuracy. It was here that Callimachus created the Pentateuch. That was an enormous complex catalog of works, really an ancestor to our modern library systems. From mathematics to medicine, the museum was the beating heart of ancient scholarship. Section 2. The Fire Everyone Remembers, Julius Caesar's Arrival in 48 BCE. And this brings us right to the climax of the story, the cinematic tragedy we all think we know so well. As civil conflict really started intensifying in Alexandria, Julius Caesar ordered ships in the harbor to be burned. The massive fire spread to the docks, catching books and scrolls in the flames. But here is where the historical record becomes a bit of a tangled web. Some later writers claimed tens of thousands of scrolls were lost in that blaze. But others suggested only a warehouse near the water burned, and that the main library, which was situated further inland, survived perfectly intact. The physical evidence simply does not support a universal story where the entire Great Library disappeared in one single catastrophic fire. Section 3. The Myth of One Night. Why the popular story is flawed. Over the centuries, the complex story of Alexandria kind of got simplified into a single, devastating night of fire. But as we're learning, history is rarely that clean. We actually know for a fact that scholarly activity continued in Alexandria for centuries after Julius Caesar's harbor fire. The intellectuals didn't just pack up and leave. Which leads us to an absolutely crucial question. What if the Library of Alexandria didn't have one dramatic ending? Let that sink in for just a moment. If it wasn't destroyed in a single blaze of glory, then we're left to face a reality that is far slower and perhaps much more tragic. Section 4. The Slow Disappearance. Centuries of Institutional Decay. The truth is deeply atmospheric and incredibly reflective. Great institutions don't always require a single moment of destruction to vanish. Often, they just fade away. When we actually examine the historical record, we see a gradual, centuries-long decline. Political instability rocked the city. Royal support eventually dried up. And without funding, those grand buildings fell into disrepair. Various smaller wars and urban riots damaged the city over generations. And slowly, the knowledge and the scholars themselves migrated to emerging intellectual centers. Imagine a great institution slowly losing its resources, year after year, decade after decade. Section 5. Other Tales of Destruction. The Serapeum and the Arab Conquest. To completely unravel this mystery, we have to look at the other legends attached to Alexandria, carefully separating historical evidence from myth, because Caesar wasn't the only one blamed. There was also the Serapeum. This was a grand temple complex, often described as a daughter library. Now, in 391 CE, it was indeed destroyed during severe religious conflicts, but historians heavily debate how many books were even still stored there at that late date. Then, there's a much later legend claiming intentional destruction during the 7th century Arab conquest. Modern historians consider this highly unreliable. By the time of that conquest, the original Great Library had likely been gone for a very long time. Section 6. What was actually lost? The True Tragedy of Ancient Knowledge. So this brings us to the biggest remaining question. What exactly disappeared from humanity's collective memory? We know many ancient works are lost, but we have to be careful not to just assume they vanished specifically because of the Library of Alexandria. This beautifully illustrates the real fragility of human knowledge. Ancient books survived under one very strict condition: they had to be continually copied. Texts disappeared because of war, yes, but they also disappeared because of simple neglect. They vanished because fragile papyrus crumbles over time, or just because nobody bothered to copy them again. The tragedy we are talking about is vastly larger than one burning building. So maybe the real mystery isn't who burned the Library of Alexandria. The far better and honestly much more unsettling question is, how does one of history's greatest institutions simply disappear? Well, it disappears through centuries of political changes, through declining support, through the natural fragility of written words. The weight of time itself brings about institutional collapse. The legacy of Alexandria highlights humanity's immense desire to collect everything we know, and our deep haunting fear that it can all disappear. The truth is much less cinematic than the legend of one enormous dramatic fire, but it's also much more profound. Civilizations do not always lose knowledge in a single catastrophe. Sometimes they lose it one forgotten book at a time.